Mark chapter 15, we'll be reading the first 15 verses. Hear the word of the Lord. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked, and among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his word. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, Rudyard Kipling begins his poem, If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can do that and other such things, you're strong, you're mature, Kipling says. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything in it. And what is more, you'll be a man, my son. Is that what it means to be mature? Well, partly. When I was beginning 8th grade, I had just moved from Alabama to a suburb of Orlando, Florida, and was riding in the school bus when a boy behind me with a lock, those combination locks used for lockers, started hitting me, or maybe tapping me, maybe hitting's too hard, but on the head, in the back of the head. And I told him to stop. I'm irritated. But then when he did it again, I stood up, being from Alabama, turned around, and began to punch the boy. For that, the school suspended me for 3 days off the bus, and my mother sentenced me to memorize Kipling's poem, If you can keep your head about you if you keep your head when all about you, I didn't memorize it that well, all are losing theirs and blaming it on you. I don't remember my father doing anything, which probably means he probably thought, yeah, I would have done the same thing too. So, whatever. What does it mean to be strong, to be mature? Now, some people seem to think that maturity is just a matter of years, kind of like rings on a tree. You gain another layer of maturity every year. I'm old enough to be your father, so you better listen to me. But if maturity is a matter of character, and that is a matter of choices, if you've been making bad choices for 80, 90, 100 years, you'll still have an immature, weak character, no matter how old you get. It's true that wisdom can be gained through the years if you've been listening to advice, if you've been learning, if you've been changing according to what you learn, if you keep your head about you when all else are losing theirs, if you make all allowances for what others think, if you fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, if you exercise your character by swimming upstream against the currents of what nearly everyone around you, except the church, I hope, says is right and true and tolerant and inclusive, if that, well then sure, your years probably do mean growth in wisdom and character. But if you've just gone with the flow, like a dead fish, even a dead fish can swim downstream. If you've always taken the path of least resistance, you always cave into pressure. If you've not actually put into practice, maybe you've heard a lot, but you've not put it into practice, you just give in when things get hard. If you've never been willing to do something when it's hard, You'll exercise, well, until you get tired. You'll diet until you get hungry. You'll stay away from bad relationships, well, until you get lonely. You'll read the Bible and pray until you lose the thrill. You'll be a faithful church member until there's a price to pay. You'll put the word into practice until it means, well, having to give, maybe, giving up some money, or maybe having to stand against someone else's sin, when that will make you pay a price. If that's the way you've been, it really doesn't matter how long you live. You'll always be weak and immature, a reed shaken in the wind, kind of like a windsock, like they put on the top of goalposts or at airports. Puffed up, shaking, but empty and pointing in whatever direction you're being blown. Maturity is not a matter of years, and strength is not a matter of power. There are people with many years that have never matured. There are people with a lot of power, but are so weak they can't stand up to the slightest winds. Indeed, democracies can promote people just like that. People who claim they, stand for something, but not really. Maybe who claim they are against homosexual marriage in one election, and then when the polls show it's convenient for them to say so, they're for it in the next. We can't just blame the leaders. Oh, they're weak. Why can't they stand up? It's what the people want. So they'll be for invading a country when they think it will be an easy win, and they'll be the same ones crying the loudest to pull our troops out of that country when it looks hard. They aren't willing to do anything hard, to stand up for something because it's true, no matter what everyone else says, to do justice because it's right, if everyone else around them is for that injustice. I have my doubts about Southern religion, whether almost any of it is real. People call the South the Bible Belt, but do you realize how historically new that is? It wasn't that way before the Civil War. Before the Civil War, Christians in the North would comment about how spiritually dark and hard the South was. It wasn't until the beginning of the Civil War and then afterward the churches began to seriously grow in the South. That's when we became the Bible Belt. But think of that. What else is going on in the South during the Civil War and afterward for about a century? These churches growing, giving the whole region a reputation for the Bible Belt. They were living at peace, first with slavery and then with segregation for a century, as this revivalism is just sweeping the South. Now, how then could a biblical faith in the one who taught, love your neighbor as yourself, you say you believe in him, and that's the second greatest commandment, and he said it's like the first, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and strength. Love your neighbor is like that. How could that faith in him live and thrive side by side with such obvious injustice? Now, maybe you can excuse many people. Okay, I understand. Many people are the sheep. They kind of take reality as they find it. They don't question too much about whether things really should be the way they are. But, okay, you excuse many people, but what about the shepherds? What about the preachers? The prophets who should be declaring, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Where were they for over a century? What were they doing? Oh, sure, they were railing against alcohol. Yeah, they would just, condemn you to hell for drinking a beer, because that was a fashionable cause. That's the way the winds of public approval were blowing. That was courage to speak up against a drink. But why were they not speaking against injustice? Why weren't they speaking for justice? Where were the Micahs saying, he has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? Where were the Jeremiahs going into the temples with a yoke on, telling the people not to listen to the false prophets, not to trust in their false assurance? Where were the men? They were weak. They were blown by the wind, and they produced generations of churchgoers that fold like paper before any resistance. Well, here we see what happens when a weak man, even one with a lot of power, is faced with the winds of injustice. We see a weak man come face to face with the strongest man who ever lived. We see that here in three parts. First, the accusation. Second, the substitution. And finally, the condemnation. As I mentioned last week, the Sanhedrin, the Jews' ruling body, technically wasn't allowed to meet at night. It meant that they were up to no good. But they got around that by waiting until the first break of dawn, and then they held their official session and announced quickly that their verdict: Jesus is guilty and he deserves death. And they've been working toward this for a while now. But there's only one more obstacle in their way to carry out their plan. They weren't allowed to implement the death penalty. That right was reserved for the Romans. The Sanhedrin could recommend it, but the Roman governor would have to actually carry it out. And that's a problem for them because they've just pronounced Jesus guilty of blasphemy. But they know that Pilate, the governor, isn't going to execute someone for blasphemy. I mean, he couldn't care less. He couldn't care less about their religious sensibilities. Indeed, he seems to have enjoyed purposely offending them from time to time, just rubbing their noses in his power. After all, he's not elected. He's not like our governors has to face election. He's appointed by the Caesar, the emperor. But they could complain to the emperor about him if he offended them. But there's no guarantee the emperor would care either. And so Pilate had people killed in the temple while offering their sacrifices. He set up Roman flags in Jerusalem with the image of Caesar on them. It's just offended, no graven image that offended them. He didn't care he certainly is not going to care. He did all that. He's not going to care if some renegade rabbi from Galilee was supposedly blaspheming the Jewish God. What are you talking about? So they would have to come up with a charge against Jesus that Pilate would care about. And that's easy. Jesus has said that he was the Christ, the anointed one who brings in God's kingdom on earth. And they could tell Pilate that the Messiah is going to overthrow the Romans. He's going to lead a revolt. He's going to rally the people to make Israel a free, independent, powerful empire again, like it was under David. That was easy to think because that's what they believed the Messiah was supposed to be anyway, that his kingdom really was of this world. And so they will tell Pilate that Jesus is making himself out to be the king of the Jews. That was their way of appealing to Pilate. Get Pilate against Jesus. That would get Pilate's attention because his number one job was to keep Israel subjugated, keep it under Roman control. Any threat to that was taken very seriously. So they come to Pilate with Jesus bound and hand him over to him with the accusation, the indictment. He's making himself out to be the king of the Jews. And Pilate asked then directly in verse 2, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Just ask him. And Jesus gives a brief but kind of mysterious answer. "You say." In Greek, that's literally it. That's all there is to it. You say. It's meant to be a yes, but a kind of yes, with a hint that, yeah, I'm a king, but not quite like what you mean. In other words, it is as you say, I am the king, but not exactly as you think. He says enough of a yes to still stay in trouble, to still be a candidate for crucifixion. But he can't fully say yes to what Pilate is asking him. I don't think he's trying to be evasive or cute or clever or anything like that. He's trying to be precise. He is the king, but not the kind of king Pilate is worried about. The chief priests then began to pour on the accusations. Notice that. They accuse him of many things, it says. They want to convince Pilate to kill him. Pilate, he said he's the Son of Man. That means he'll be seated on a throne judging everyone. He said he's going to become judging everyone, even us, even you, Pilate. That's what he said. He said he's coming to smash all earthly kingdoms. That's what it says in Daniel 7. He said he's fulfilling that prophecy. He'll smash all earthly, even Rome, he'll smash Rome. That's what he said. He said he will rule with God's authority over all the earth, even over Rome, Pilate. That's what he said. He must be stopped. Many things. In verse 3, many accusations. The winds are blowing against Jesus. The weak will be carried along with it. One of the tactics of plotters, schemers, naggers, what are the tactics they use, either in politics or even just personal relationships or in churches? The tactics they use to sway the weak is just agitate with many accusations, just nonstop accusations, to whip up a sense of panic, a frenzy that this problem that they've whipped up themselves, that this problem can only be solved. You'll have to agree, because there's so many accusations. It can only be solved if we get rid of him, the one we hate. Either the president or the senator, or if you change your mind about what this, or in some churches even get rid of the pastor. He's done this. He's doing that. Even if you try to answer every accusation, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. Ever played that? Whack-a-mole? You knock one down, accusation down, another one pops up. And the weak eventually conclude, well, then the only way to have peace, to be done with this, is to give in to the many accusations. Maybe if I give in, I vote for someone else, or cave into the nagging. There's always complaining about one thing after another, and then promises, if you give in to me on this, just this, then after that, this last time, I'll be nice to you again. I'll be a peaceful voter. I'll be a happy church member. I'll be a submissive wife, a good kid. And the weak blow in the wind. Now, Pilate hears these many accusations and asks Jesus in verse 4, have you no answer to make? Because Jesus hearing him too, and he's not saying anything. Pilate's hearing a lot of froth, a lot of anger, a lot of agitation. He knows they're trying to push his buttons, trying to get him to see Jesus as a revolutionary, a rebel out to lead a revolt. But he picks up the fact that there's no content there. There's nothing specific. There's no actual proof that he's done anything against Rome, as far as he can see. He's not organizing any underground army. He's not stockpiling weapons anywhere. He's not running a terrorist training camp out there in Galilee. He's not even calling for the overthrow of the Romans. He's not even saying, don't pay taxes. So, Pilate is beginning to hear the accusation and knows there's a lot of heat. But where's the beef? But what really amazes him is that Jesus isn't trying to defend himself. Now, normally a man on trial for his life is just going to be frantically trying to prove his innocence. Every false accusation, he's going to be shouting back, lies! They lie! And desperately shouting, no! And arguing as much as he can. Their life is on the line, and they don't care about how pathetic they look. Maybe a few, hardcore rebels will actually admit to it and denounce Rome, death to Caesar! Give some kind of passionate anti-Roman speech as they're being dragged off by the soldiers. But Jesus isn't doing any of that. His composure, his strength, his ability to keep his head about him when all else would be losing theirs is amazing. His regal stability under such pressure amazes Pilate. The accusation is that Jesus is a king. The accusation is true. The accusation then leads to the substitution. Pilate's impressed with Jesus, and he knows from all the empty, shrill accusations and from Jesus' composure that Jesus didn't do anything wrong. What has he done? He's going to ask. he can't find anything. The accusers are agitated. They're nearly hysterical, but they have nothing real. Pilate now wants to release Jesus. He's supposed to release Jesus. He's called by God and by the Roman government to do justice. Now, often God and the Roman government had very different ideas about what justice would mean, but in this case, they agree. Innocent men should go free. Now, how to do that? He's got to work with these people. So how is he going to let Jesus go free, do what's right? He could just issue his verdict. Jesus is innocent. Order him released. And tell the chief priests, don't bother me again with your personal vendettas. I'm not interested in your theology. But even dictators have to pay some attention to how people feel. And so he thinks of a clever ploy. He'll appeal to democracy. That's it. He had a custom of releasing one prisoner at the Passover, and it just so happens to be the Passover. One prisoner, the people, and he allowed the people to select. Let the people decide. Vote on it. And he knew that many of the common people did respect the priests, so surely they'll ask to let Jesus go. He probably heard about how Jesus was welcomed just a few days earlier on Sunday with hosannas. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that way Pilate thinks, well, Jesus, he can do the right thing. He can let the innocent man go free and still not make the priests angry. After all, he's got to do business with these men regularly. He doesn't want to face their nagging and their discontent, their complaining every day because he chose to release Jesus. Now we can just say, democracy made me do it. The people spoke, and me, a humble servant of the people, did what they asked. Yeah, it's going to work. It's win-win, he thinks. But there was another prisoner. There was a rebel who had committed murder in his opposition to Rome, Barabbas. It's an interesting, simple name, Barabbas. Who names their child Barabbas? It means son of a father. Imagine a son is born and you name him son of a father. Now, surely every man is a son of a father, just like every woman is a daughter of a father. He's a murderer, a thief, a rebel. He's Barabbas. And every man. Now, surely there was nothing about him that would make the people choose him over Jesus, over the one who was just hailed just a few days before. The crowd came to Jesus to ask for the prisoner of their choice to be released. Now is Pilate's chance. The timing could not be better as far as he's concerned. He has this man he knows is innocent. He wants to let him go, and it happens to be the very day when he's supposed to release a prisoner of their choice. So he could get Jesus off his hands without having to take responsibility. And so he asked them a leading question. Notice the way he asked it. He didn't even ask, which of these choices do you want me to release? He asked them, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? He's your king, after all. Don't you want your king? You've been waiting for centuries for your king now. He's the long-expected king, born to set his people free. Pilate wants them to choose Jesus because he knows Jesus is innocent, that Jesus is not the kind of king Rome was worried about. And that in verse 10, he also could see that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Envy. Envy is resenting what others have. The accusers, the chief priests, resented what Jesus had. The kingdom, the authority, the rule of God. Like the son of a vineyard owner. You know, that parable Jesus told? Probably just a few days before this. You know, the man had a vineyard, lent it out to stewards to take care of it, to managers, they call them stewards, sent servants to go get his rent from these people. They beat some, and then he eventually sends his son to the managers, the stewards of the vineyard. And they kill the son of the owner, thinking that now they can get the vineyard, since he's the heir of the vineyard. They kill him. Well, they envied his right to inherit the vineyard. Here, they envied Jesus' right over this temple. You know, they wanted it to be theirs. They envied him. They envied his right over this nation, his authority to do what they claim to be doing as priests, making people right with God. He actually did it. Your sins are forgiven, he could say. They envied it. So they thought if they could kill him, maybe they could get it. Pilate saw, probably not all of that, but he saw that it was indeed out of envy. That was the motive, that envy, that at least some of the people loved and respected him, and not them, not the priest. He was popular. They weren't. They didn't do it because they cared. They didn't do it because they cared about blasphemy. They did it because they wanted what he had. Pilate saw that it was all about envy, and so he should let them go then, shouldn't he? But he wants to shake off responsibility on the people, using his custom of releasing one prisoner. And now, sure, he thinks there's Barabbas, the murdering every man, but there's a substitute. They'll want Jesus as the substitute to be released. Surely they will. Someone is going to be released because of the substitute. There is substitution. But the priest had prepared the crowd. They had thought of this ahead of time, this part. The people Pilate was asking, hoping they would relieve him of the responsibility for what he was, for doing what was right. That's what he was hoping. But these people were full of the priest people, and they were spreading rumors to the rest about Jesus, accusing Jesus, all kinds of things. And Barabbas, yeah, sure, he did some things wrong, but he's a patriot, don't you know? He's on our side. Not like Jesus. He said pay taxes to Caesar. He did this. He said that. One thing after another. It's just exhausting to trying to keep up with all the accusations until finally, even if you can't substantiate any of them, you conclude it's easier to get rid of him. Weak people choose what is convenient, not what is right. I think we've seen that in this country in the last 20 years or so on the homosexual, quote, marriage debate. At first it seemed just outlandish. I think most of us my age or older think it was just outlandish. This is bizarre. You would even suggest such a thing as a same-sex marriage. I mean, when I was first suggest, what in the world? But then they kept nagging for it, never-ending propaganda, that snuck into TV dramas everywhere, even into children's movies like Beauty and the Beast. Constant accusations that those who are against it were haters and bigots, never-ending harassment of those who dared to speak up about what marriage really is. I think it got to the point where many people just concluded, yeah, it's just easier to cave in. It's just easier to give them what they want. Now they'll do the same thing with transgenderism or whatever else they want to push on us. The weak people will be swept along, repeating the new slogans that everyone else is repeating. Here, the chief priest had prepped the crowd. So instead of following Pilate's leading question, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? They asked for Barabbas. Barabbas is scheduled for execution, for crucifixion. He's guilty. He deserves it. Pilate wants him to be crucified and the innocent Jesus to go free. He has the power to do it. But he's a weak man. A weak man with power. He first pathetically, kind of hopes Jesus will give him a good reason to let him go, because Jesus could talk his way out of this, but he doesn't. He's amazed when he doesn't. Jesus just stays quiet. Now he's hoping the crowd will let him do the right thing without having to take responsibility. That's what weak men do. They refuse to take responsibility. They'll do whatever the strongest currents around them are pushing them to do. They'll be swept along in immorality if their lust are moving them that way. They'll give all their time to their business and none to God and the church if their greed or their money is moving them that way. Maybe they'll even go to church if their wife nags them to go to church, but not for the Lord, not because they really care. They're just weak and it's the way the winds are blowing. Or maybe they'll drop out of a biblical church if the wife nags them to do that too. They might know what is right, like Pilate here. People might tell them plainly what is right, but they're too weak to do it. They're swept along like a dead fish downstream. Pilate's too weak to do what is right, so he hopes democracy will relieve him of his responsibility. Do you want me to release the king? No, they say. We want the rebel. And that's what sinners always choose. Rebels over the king. And Pilate is flummoxed. And so we ask in verse 12. Notice that in verse 12. He's asking. Why is he asking? He knows what's right. He has the power to do it. Why won't he do it? Why is he asking them? Because he's too weak. He wants to be a politician. He wants to make the people happy more than he wants to do what's right. And so he asks, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? They shout back, crucify him. Pilate asks again. He's asking. He asks back, why? What evil has he done? Pilate, you've just answered your own question. If you can't find that he's done any evil, you must let him go. You can't crucify an innocent man just to placate a clamoring, hysterical mob. What's he done? Pilate doesn't know. The people don't know. But they are unreasonable. They shout louder and louder, crucify him. He has the power to do the right thing. All he has to do is say, no. He has done nothing wrong. He could then even send in his troops to disperse the crowd, armed with their whips that they'll soon be using. He knows Jesus is innocent. He knows what is right, but he's a weak man, and so he's blown with the wind. There's accusations that amount to nothing. There's substitution, in which Jesus takes the place of every man. And there's condemnation. Pilate in verse 15, wishing to satisfy the crowd, notice that, wishing to satisfy the crowd, wanting to make this murderous mob happy, taking the path of least resistance, caving in to the nagging, blown by the winds like a windsock, losing his head when all else around him are losing theirs, and prepared to blame it on him, wishing to satisfy the crowd. The worst verdict of a man's character possible. Like weak people today who know what's right, who know the absurdity. Maybe they know the absurdity of a homosexual marriage, or know the importance of going to church, or keeping your covenants, or hearing the word, or following the word, sacrificing luxuries and fancy vacations for the sake of giving, seeking first the kingdom of God. They've heard it all. They know it all. They even say on one level they believe it all. But they want to satisfy whatever. Maybe the wife who's nagging for nice things for herself, another vacation at the beach, or a church where she doesn't have to be bothered with the word. Or maybe the boyfriend who wants to have sex. The kids who want whatever they want. The friends that want you to be tolerant in the new intolerant definition of the word. And so, seeking to satisfy them, you cave. You lose your head because you don't want them blaming something on you. Here, this weak man issues the condemnation. Jesus is crucified because a weak man with power couldn't stand up and do what he knew was right. And what makes you think you would do any differently if you're too weak to do what's right now? There's the accusations that amount to nothing, that are just excuses for envy that he's the king and they're not. There's the substitution, not the murderer for the innocent Jesus as it should be, but Jesus for the everyman, for the murderers, the thieves, for us rebels. And then there's the condemnation. Jesus is condemned because even people with power are too weak to do what is right, even when they know it's right. So Pilate has Jesus scourged for no reason, just to satisfy the crowds. The scourging would be with a whip with many lashes. with pieces of sharp bone and lead or rocks tied into it. It would sometimes rip pieces of flesh off. Often 2 men would inflict it, alternating from 2 sides. They could do it until the ribs are showing. Some men would die just from the scourging. These are the stripes by which we are healed. What did he do wrong? Nothing. All this is so that a weak man with power could satisfy the crowds. But weak people do the same today. They know what's right. They've been told. But they get swept along by the nagging that they feel they just must satisfy when the currents were flowing in the right direction. When it was easy to serve God, you had the money, excess money to give, and you could give it. When everything was new and fulfilling and exciting, when everybody around you was encouraging you, then it was easy. Here are the same crowds that were cheering for Jesus just the Sunday before. It's Friday, and just the previous Sunday, these crowds were shouting, "Hosanna," and putting palm branches in front of Jesus, hailing him as their king. They've gone from cheers on Sunday to jeers on Friday. The disciples are nowhere to be found. They've not kept their heads about them when all else were losing theirs. Now the king is being stretched out, bent over, and having the skin of his back ripped off because weak people can't do what's right, even when they know it's right. Jesus is condemned to death. But the condemnation doesn't stop there. Sure, Pilate is condemned for murdering the righteous one. In Acts chapter 4, verse 28, the apostles say to God in prayer that Pilate had committed murder in God's eyes, and so he would ultimately pay for it himself. There will be condemnation for him. But oddly enough, they say also in prayer that Pilate did what, quote, God's hand and plan had predestined to take place. In other words, Pilate did what he did, as weak and as sniveling and as cowardly and spineless as he was, because God determined that he would do that. Now, does that mean that Pilate's free of condemnation? Because he was just God's instrument to carry out God's plan. He did what God's hand and plan predestined to take place. Is he free of condemnation? No, Pilate did what he did, murder the only truly innocent person who ever lived, because that's the kind of man he was. A weak, sniveling, cowardly, spineless man with power who couldn't do what was right because he cared more about satisfying the crowds. That's who he was. He acted out of his own character. And God put him there for that. Because this is far more than a morality tale about how we just need to grow up and learn to keep our heads about us. And when everyone else is losing theirs and blaming on us, how we need to have a spine and do what's right, even when everyone else is pressuring us to cave in. This means a lot more than just don't be like Pilate. God's hand and plan predestined that this would take place because God had a right condemnation of us rebels. We have condemnation. What's he done? He's taken our condemnation. We are, like Barabbas, the son of a father, the son of Adam. And like the everyman, rebels. And as rebels, we deserve condemnation. The accusations against us are true. We are sentenced to punishment for our rebellion. And an infinite crime against the infinite king deserves an infinite punishment. But then, amazingly, there's a substitute. Jesus steps forward. And he is the king himself. He's the very one we rebelled against. But he doesn't take the easy ways out. The Lord lays on him the iniquity, the condemnation of us all. And so he's stretched out, scourged, and led away to be crucified so that our rebellion, our weakness, our relationship with God could be healed. That's what He's done for you.